Can Washington flip one of California's best receivers?
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He writes with me over at Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Lars, we got a really fun show coming at all the everydayers today, but just a quick reminder, wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, make sure to click that subscribe button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review. It all really does help us out a lot. And wherever you're just on social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, we're on there as well at Locked On Huskies. Shoot us follow over there as well. Lars, like I said, really fun show coming at all the everydayers today. A UW legend is back in the fold. Quincy Pondexter is making his return. He's part of Danny Sprinkle's coaching staff again after one season at USC. We'll dive into that, and we're going to dive into some interesting offers and whatever's going on in the secondary in terms of the 2026 class. But the big news, according to On3's Chad Simmons, Washington is in the mix for a trio of 4-star recruits from California that are committed to SEC schools. That's Vance Spafford from Georgia, or from Mission Viejo's, committed to Georgia. We've talked about him a little bit on this program. And then Daniel Odom, an Oklahoma commit, and Madden Williams, a Texas A&M commit.
And both, I believe, Madden Williams and Daniel Odom go to St. John Bosco, as you mentioned.
Right.
The other one is Mission Viejo. And you look at it and think, from a size perspective, obviously there's two different types here, because Vance Spafford is 5'11", kind of that more slot guy, can do a bunch of different things, but just a little bit on a smaller size. Daniel Odom and more so Madden Williams are the ones where you're talking about an outside type of receiver. And to me, it's a matter of, what do you want to do with the position? What are you looking for this year? Because you reloaded last year, so now you're kind of looking and you're being more selective, I think, this season in this class, where you're saying, we want to go get a top-end guy, probably one or two at least. But of that trio, I mean, Vance Spafford is a guy for me where I just love what he could do in the slot. But you look at the slot position, it's like, do you need one more of those, especially with another name that we could, we've talked about it a lot, which is Mason James. That also factors into this as well.
I was going to say, you just said his name.
Exactly. But so for me, I had to say it in the correct timing, though, because I said it before. And so with this one, for me, it's, Daniel Odom is the one that, we've heard a little bit about. He came up for the junior day. Haven't heard a ton since then. Obviously, Washington did flip another Oklahoma commit, Marcus Harris, last year. For me, I think I would go Madden Williams, Vance Spafford, Daniel Odom in that order. That's just a personal preference, though.
So I like where you're going with this, where Vance Spafford is, where you talk about just like the two different types of receivers. Vance Spafford absolutely falls into that slot where, as Audric Harris told us during spring practice, the Jacob Cowing, Giles Jackson sort of role, where I look at him and I say, Vance Spafford has the frame and everything to line up on the inside more often than not. But with the way this offense works, there are multiple different packages and formations that you can roll him out in, where you can find ways to get him free releases on the outside, or even just throw him out on the boundary and line him up against the corner, because he has that level of speed and route running skills to find ways to win consistently. So I'm really interested in just what that recruitment is going to look like, because feels like there might be a couple other teams in the mix there as well. The same with all these guys, right? But I look at Vance, and it just, since he was the one who just seemed to be that priority target very early on, commits to Georgia in the middle of November. And then since then, he was also on campus for the junior day. And then he comes back for a spring practice as well. So he's been around for a little while, just in terms of that name. You and I have talked about him before on the show. And when you look at just kind of those two different types of receivers, it leads into the other two, whether it be Madden Williams and Daniel Odom, who I like them both a lot. I think they're very similar players, where, you gave your order, and I respect that. Personally, I haven't come up with one yet, so that's why I don't have one just yet, because I watch both of them and I say they're very similar players. They really are. And it's one of those things where you look at who you have committed already in Terrence Sarri. You look at Washington standing for Mason James and say, yeah, that seems like a guy who you want to take no matter what, even if, you might feel that he's redundant with a skill set of a Vance Spafford and Terrence Sarri, because you never want to turn down somebody with that kind of skill set, especially one that doesn't play just in your region of the country, which is something you and I have talked about a lot with this 26 class, is expanding that footprint and going out there and finding new ways to just recruit talent to the Pacific Northwest, to Washington, from, in Mason James' case, Oklahoma, or in Derrick Samet's case, out in New Jersey. You find ways to just continue expanding those boundaries. And having somebody like Daniel Odom or Madden Williams in that fold just is very, very complimentary, because you go and you just look through all the receiver offers, the guys who are committed, or just even a lot of the uncommitted guys who, were going to take visits. Luke Weaver was a big one who ended up committing to USC, where you still want one of those big outside threats that last year for you was Desi Jose. And now you're just kind of looking to continue to just build on that and expand on it, because we look where this offense is right now with, Justice Williams behind and Rasheed Williams behind Denzel Boston. And then Desi Jose obviously in there as well. You have a whole lot of potential on the outside, and just continuing to stack that while you just have those versatile receivers who some people might look at them and say, well, they're a little undersized for the position. But Jedd Fisch has always found a way to succeed with just that type of receiver as well.
And then you got to throw in Justice Williams as well. Another Williams, Madden Williams, that also kind of may have played a small factor into why. I mean, throw another Williams in there, might as well.
Right.
We got Rasheed, Damon. Throw another one in there. Get the Williams offense going. Williams brothers, I don't know. But you think about it, because you make a great point, and I think that's what's interesting, where we talk about all the time, where, hey, you got to keep the Cali guys on the West Coast. You got to keep the Washington guys home. You got to keep this. But by the way, you also got to expand your footprint. It's like, well, you got to – beggars can't be choosers. You got to pick one somewhere along the line. And so when you talk about Vance Spafford being a Mission Viejo kid committing to Georgia, that's something we talked about with the Ohio States, the Alabamas back in the 2016, 17, 18 classes, all the way to now, where they started coming west. Yep. A lot of schools, aside from Oregon and USC and a handful of others, did not have as much success going east. The fact that Washington now has that staying power, where you've got Raiden Weinsberg from Florida, even though he was from Arizona. You go and get Donovan Robinson from Illinois. You go and get Derrick Zamet, as you mentioned, from New Jersey. You're spreading your wings a bit, potentially Andy Murray from Ohio. You just kind of start sprinkling in some guys. And so that's why I could see them, like if you take Mason James and Vance Spafford ends up going somewhere else or sticking with Georgia, that's fine. Because, okay, you lose a Cali guy to a SEC school, but you take an SEC kid out of Big 10, Big 12 SEC country from Oklahoma, and then you still keep one of the Cali big guys out west. I think that's kind of how you – because you're not going to win all these battles. No school is going to win all of these battles. And you look at some schools, even the school down south and school all the way down I-5 at USC, you can only take so much talent. And there's a point at which guys are going to be like, hey, you know what? You got 3-4 stars. Okay, Washington got one. It's like, okay, great. Maybe that one ends up working out better. And so it's just a matter of finding the right combination of guys, because they're going to take a slot and a big. It's just a matter of where the location is going to be on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I think legitimately does help this, when you look at it from a national perspective, because obviously we here on the West Coast know that Cody Green is from Washington. Cody Green started his career at Eastside Catholic. But when you look at it and you talk about keeping these big name players on the West Coast and seeing, hey, Cody Green, a top 5 player, top 10 player in the class, according to On3, top 5 player in California, according to 247, is staying on the West Coast and going to Washington. Obviously, he was committed to Oregon before that. I feel like that's something that helps this as well, and playing in the Trinity League, he's gotten a chance to see some of these guys up close and personal, and you're able to do some of that recruiting. And I feel all those things just kind of go hand in hand at a certain point, especially when you're talking about the Trinity League in Southern California and everything that goes along with that. But I like where you're going, because there is space in this class for, as you said, one slot receiver and one big guy. How those numbers are going to work out is yet to be seen, but I do like the approach that Jedd Fisch and Kevin Cummings are taking with this, where we're not just going to say, oh yeah, we're going to settle here, we're going to settle there, but we're going to go out there and aggressively try to flip some of these top players that are committed to the SEC, that are committed to other Big Ten schools, because we know that that's how you find the best talent, is by just continuing to improve your sales pitch. And it was something that I got to talk about with Derek Coleman-Brusa on this here show yesterday, which was, that sales pitch that Jedd Fisch gave me, he made me realize that Washington has more to offer than those other schools that I was considering. And I think that's something that down the line with this 2026 class, if it ends up where you and I believe it could, inside the top 15 nationally, that's something that we might hear from more of these guys if they were to end up flipping to Washington. But Lars, let's go to the other side of the ball. Let's talk about some defensive backs. Right after message from our good friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have way more ways than ever to play smart and win big. One of those big moments for me is watching the Celtics in that pivotal Game 3 win over the New York Knicks. I think they're trending in the right direction. I like the way that series is going. And I just love the way this entire playoff series, all these semifinals have shaped up. Seeing what the Cavs and the Pacers are doing, that's been a really fun series to watch. The Thunder and the Nuggets, that's been really wild. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, Lars, as we look at the secondary, there's a lot to get to here. I think we should start with the legacy. That's Derrick Johnson II. And he has, after not including Washington in his top 6, he is going to be taking an official visit to Washington on May 30th. And I really like this for John Richardson in this 2026 class.
And this was a guy that we've talked about before, where we were a little surprised when they didn't make it, but then we also kind of thought, well, they did just enter the race like earlier in that month. I think it was like February 6th, they got the offer. February 25th, he ended up cutting his list down to 6. And it was one where it's like, you got the size, you got the Cali connection, you got the legacy connection. And it's like, how are we not in this one? And ironically, I actually tweeted out the day before that story came out. Oh, well, they offered his younger brother Darius, and okay, you missed out on the older brother. Go in early on the younger brother, who already has, I think, 12, 13, 14 offers now. But it still made sense where it's like, hey, if you're going to offer the younger brother, that means you're probably like re-entering the race for his older brother. And for me, that's good, because you look at the room and you look at the position of need. It's like, yeah, that's a perfect fit in terms of long, lengthy, athletic. And anytime you can get a former Huskies kid, like, that's a bonus. But it's a part of, like, I was kind of just initially shocked that the offer didn't even come in earlier. But, it is what it is, and they made up the ground, which seems to be a hallmark of the staff.
Yeah, this staff has done a really good job with that. And it's, why we wanted to open this talking about the receivers and then move into this, was because the staff, even though they seem to be in a solid spot with a lot of those guys early on, they've continued to fight and continue to make up that ground, say, even though you're committed, we're going to find ways to keep ourselves in the race, maybe get an official visit until signing day. And that seems like it's the case here, where they did offer really late. And it was something where you go and you turn on his film. He does look a lot like his dad. His instincts and his break on the ball are so much fun to watch. And then just coupling that with the fact that this is a position of need, plus just the way he plays fits what John Richardson wants to do really well. He is that long, aggressive press corner. And I look at the guys that Washington already has committed in this class. I have some thoughts on one of these players that I'll get to in a little bit, where Kasani Giles, he looks like he's going to play that nickel role. You've got an outside corner in Elijah Durr, and then, as he told us here on the show, a safety in CJ Lavender. Even though he's listed as a cornerback, I think there might be some flexibility there, which is what I'm hinting at, but I'm going to save that for a little bit, because I look at Derrick Johnson and I say, he doesn't preclude you taking, Jerron Jones or Devon Benjamin or one of these other top flight corners that you might be in on. And at the same point, you're getting a legacy. You're getting somebody who fits the program really well. And if, he needs to wait a year or two because he has to put on some weight or do this or do that, that's fine, because you have that flexibility.
Exactly. And you look at it thinking, it's almost like kind of like Laura Bryant. If you think about the similar kind of makeup, just not necessarily exactly like in that example, but just a guy where you can look and think, it's not necessarily a solid, not a permanent depth piece, but a guy that you can say, we can see in 18 to 24 months working into that rotation, working up. If you have to, you could start right away. You could jump into the mix, but you look at it and think that it's not going to necessarily be a guaranteed starter right away, but a guy that you just really need the depth piece to. And just overall, when you're looking to build that secondary depth at cornerback, because you're losing a couple of guys with Jakari on Ephesians, but right. Beyond that, you have Dylan Robinson coming in the fall, likely going to be the guy. But beyond that, spots open. And so I think you're looking at it and saying, this is a guy where you can either take it as a depth piece or take it as a potential starter down the line. And either way, you're going to be happy with the take.
Oh, obviously, I think that with you always want them to be those potential starters down the line, because I think the more we look at this, the more the 26 corner depth chart is set at the top, where Dylan Robinson, just from the way this staff seems to feel about him, will be up there alongside Leroy Bryant, who's continued to impress. And I just look at it down the line. It's, yeah, you can find ways to, integrate a guy like that. And if he plays his way out of the field early, great. Like we think about Darrion Clemens and Ramon Adams behind him. There is a lot of room to just reload that position right now. But speaking of reloading, I look at some of these guys just all over the secondary, because I mentioned CJ Lavender having some thoughts about his position right now. I think that this coaching staff might want to start him at safety and maybe have him float down a nickel or do a couple of different things. And a lot of that is because of one of the offers that Washington sent out to the 2026 class this week. Usually a little late to be doing that, but Gavin Day, a safety from Faith Lutheran High School in Las Vegas, I watched his film. I look at that size and I said, oh yeah, they should take this guy immediately, because he's one of those just kind of true safeties. He's listed at 6'3", 190. And I watched that film and I said, he would fit so well in this defense, in just kind of the role we've seen CJ Christian playing during spring practice, of somebody who can come downhill and he can hit, he can play in the box, he can drop back and play over the top. And just, he gives you all that flexibility that you're looking for. And Dre Pollard is the other offer, by the way. I know we'll get to him in a minute, but I wanted to stick on this point of, you can still take a guy like CJ Lavender, who's a little bit on the smaller side. I believe he's listed at 5'10", 170 or 175, something in that ballpark. And you can have him still play some nickel, play some free safety, and just do a whole lot of different things while getting that versatility and the just much needed size that you want from that other safety spot in a guy like Gavin Day. And it's something where I don't necessarily believe that this impacts the recruitment of Chase Calicut, the 4-star safety from Texas that Washington's been in on at all, really, because you can still find a way to reload that position with both of those guys. But the more I look at it, the more I say, this guy has just immediately vaulted into one of just if I were, Taylor Mays, John Richardson, Brian Walters, one of my top priorities at the position.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like size-wise, reminds me of Alex McLaughlin. You're 6'3", 190, just that kind of hitter type of frame. But you look at the play style, yeah, absolutely, playmaker. All the guy has range and versatility and things like that. But again, it kind of gets down to what we're alluding to, which is you're talking about, CJ Lavender at 5'11", mold, where you're talking, okay, you could have a shorter guy, maybe more so like a nickel safety-ish, but then you still want to have a hitter. And I think neither one of these guys take away from, CJ Chase Calicut or anything like that. But the one that really intrigues me is Dre Pollard. That's one where I looked at, because obviously I wrote that article on Huskies Wire, and I just looked through his offers list and I'm like, how is this like? It didn't make sense initially, but then you look at it, he's from Ed W. Clark High School, which is the same one as Dominic Harris, another offensive line target for Washington. So they clearly like that high school in terms of the product that comes out of it. And for me, it's 6', 175. It's an interesting mix, because you got Minnesota in there, you got a few other schools in the mix, and it's like, okay, what's the appeal here? What are we driving at? Is this to get Harris? Is this to, because it's a really intriguing offer, because I like how he plays, but it's just like, how does he fit in with like everybody else that we're mentioning here? It's like, that's what intrigued me the most.
So what I'm really curious about is, you mentioned Minnesota. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of those things where, if he does end up taking a visit to Washington, because I believe that Minnesota visit is set up for the May 30th weekend. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yep.
So I have a feeling that Washington might be trying to push for that weekend, where it's just one of those things where Washington just has a little bit of a bigger brand and that staying power than that Minnesota program does at, really any point, but especially right now. And I look at that and I say, if you really want to make a move on that guy, you have an opportunity to do that, because one player who I don't believe is going to be visiting anymore, who is set for that weekend, is Ryan Gilbert, 3-star corner from Texas, because he released a top 3 list at some point last week, week before, and Washington was not on it. And he was a guy you and I had some brief conversations about on the show, where it was, this would be a really interesting take. And he plays in that same style that CJ Lavender does, that Kasani Giles does. And Kasani Giles, obviously, he goes to IMG in Florida, but is somebody who's originally from Southern California as well. And those are the kinds of players where, if they're similar skill sets and they're all, in the same like ratings ballpark, you usually want to go for the guys that are closer to home. It's, when you get into a conversation about big time blue chip prospects, as we just did with wide receivers, it's where you're a little more willing to take a bigger swing outside your region. But I look at just kind of what Dre Pollard brings to the table, and it's, if you kind of envisioned Ryan Gilbert in that same like nickel mode that Kasani Giles was in, or that maybe you want to have CJ Lavender just kind of learn as well. This is something where I can see him doing that, but he also has the flexibility and the size to play outside if you need it.
Exactly. And I think that's something where it's the position versatility where we've seen John Richardson prove like, hey, you can have tall cornerbacks, you can have shorter cornerbacks. It's can you play? Can you use your physicality and technique? Height necessarily it's important. Don't get me wrong in terms of, if you have a 6'4" cornerback like Takario, you're going to cook. But we've seen it with Trent McDuffie where you can be 5'10" and hold that thing down on the outside. So it's just a matter of, do you have the ability to play, which again, we obviously know John Richardson, Brian Walters, and Taylor Mays are going to find those guys who have that caliber because that's just the type of coaches they are.
Lars, let's shift gears here. Let's talk a little basketball because a UW legend is back on campus. And we'll get to that right after a message from our friends over at Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is also smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKDOWNCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKDOWNCollege for half off your first year. So, Lars, this is something that, let's be real here. It was a matter of when, not if. Where after Wesley Yates, Quincy Pondexter's cousin, chose to come back to Washington after spending a year at USC, and Quincy was not retained by the USC coaching staff. There's a mutual parting of ways, whatever happened with that. It was, okay, when's Quincy going to come back? And it's really cool to see how this played out, where there were different rumors about what that, role might have looked like, which is why we didn't dive into it too much, where it's, hey, we heard it might be this or it might be that. And we just said, no, once it happens, we'll talk about it. We'll have a little bit more fun with that conversation. And so now seeing Quincy come back as a special assistant to the head coach and Danny Sprinkle, I really like what's going on with the staff. Because we look at the bench, right? We've talked about what that looks like with Tony Bland and Andy Hill, DeMarlo Slocum, and Jerry Hobie. And then all of a sudden, you also have Abdul Gaddy, who proved to be just a really nice, just supplemental piece in his role as I believe it was director of like performance. I can't remember the exact title, but having that plus having Quincy Pondexter, who has 3 years now, of experience as an assistant coach on the bench. I just think the staff is starting to become really, really valuable.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one where bringing Abdul Gaddy back was great, but it's also the fact that now you bring both back. You're not replacing director of player development is what his title is. But the reason why having Pondexter come back as a special assistant is you now have both in the building. This is an example of the resources at Washington are different than other schools, where previously it might have to be, okay, well, Gaddy will go to some other school and he'll have to leave, and then Pondexter can come in. It's like, great that Quincy came back, but it would be nice to have both and build out that bench, build out your program, build out your organization. And this is an example of that, where I think, Danny, obviously, I don't know what exactly how long their relationship goes back, but it just clearly seems like there is a prior relationship on some level. Like, I'm sure we'll find out more about that when we get to talk to Danny again. But with that being said, anytime you can bring a former alum back that was at USC, so coached in the Big Ten, you can add that, and obviously bringing Wesley Yates with him. I'm not saying it was a package deal, but it just happened. Family begets family, and I think that's an important thing for Washington. Where initially, it's like, wow, you lost Wesley, you lost all these pieces. It's like, yeah, but then you brought actually a decent amount back. You brought all the good pieces in, and Hans Steinbach coming in as well, number one European player, all those sorts of things. Like, yeah, all these things these are the investments that we knew Danny was going to have to make and we knew Danny would make. And it's kind of cool to see how it came about, because I'm really glad that it's a special assistant and not just because special assistant titles are kind of ambiguous in terms of you can do whatever, you're special. You are kind of the assistant head. You're the assistant to the assistant head coach in terms of you are the guy I'm going to task you with these three things. Go get this recruit, go get that guy, go get that transfer. And that's a perfect role for Quincy because represents Washington well, knows their brand, and knows what it means to be Husky.
No, I really like where you're going with that. I want to just kind of switch gears here a little bit, just in that same mold though, because you mentioned Hans Steinbach. And this is a guy you and I had a discussion about a couple weeks ago when Nico Bondalo backed off his commitment to Washington. And I feel like a big part of that was Hans Steinbach just being as physically ready to play as he looks. And it just kind of begs the question, is this roster set? Because we look at, some of the basketball accounts out there saying, oh, hey, look at what Washington's just kind of two deep roster looks like right now. This is pretty solid. And it does look pretty solid. But I look at one position in particular. I look at the wing and I say, there's still room to make another acquisition there. Where you and I have talked about Darrion Williams, he still, is just kind of sitting out there. So, and that's the name where, if speaking of Quincy Pondexter, if you need like an extra selling point to get you over the edge, I'm not saying anything there, but it's a possibility, right? And I just I look at all this and I say, this roster feels pretty close to being set. But I look at that wing right now where you could just go with a 3-guard lineup. You could just start, Wesley Yates, Kwamari Peterson, and Zoom Diallo. And I don't think anybody is going to be mad at that. Because then you have Jacob Ogdasevich in there, and you have Frank Kapdong at the 5, and you're happy. Like, that's a pretty solid starting 5. But you look at it, and it's, hey, maybe Zoom is just kind of playing that 6th man role again this year because you can bring in a Darrion Williams. I think it just does that much more to take the roster over the top. But when I sit back and look at it, because, I've seen this question circulating on social media a lot, I don't think there's a wrong answer right now. Like you correct me if I'm wrong there, though.
I don't think if they had to play a game next week, I think we're okay with the roster. I do agree that, if you want to add one more, that last final piece of the puzzle. But I mean, Danny already said it. Like, he expects this roster already, what he has, to be an NCAA tournament team. So with that being said, like, I don't think you have to make another addition. Now, again, if you go out and get a Darrion Williams, great. Like that's the type of addition that you're only looking at this point. You're not looking at, hey, we're going to take a flyer on this guy and we'll give him you're not doing another Dominic Diamande. Okay. You're not doing another, and that's no slight to Dominic, because obviously like Hans is, you're still doing the European connection, but you're just the way that whole thing worked out, where you're not going to take a flyer on a guy just for the sake of taking a flyer on a guy. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it's like you just don't need to at this point with the roster that you have, because like, what do you gain from adding a guy who's either not going to play or going to be a long-term piece? You can, okay, that's great, but like that's not going to impact this year's roster. What we're looking at, the 2 deeps in the starting 5, because you have Matty Troyori, you have Hans Steinbach, you have enough depth in the front court and in the back court. I don't want to see it. Like, I mean, you got Cortland Muldrew, you got JJ Maniquit as a point guard. There's enough depth there where if you want to add, I would still say a transfer. Like, you're not going to add another high school guy, but you could. Like, and so that there's
right.
I'm open to it, but again, it's like you're looking for a very specific player.
So let me throw a name at you, somebody who we have talked about before on the show. And it's something where if you want to just take one more player to just add extra depth, where it's, hey, it's nice to know that we have this guy. And in this case, it's somebody who maybe doesn't see the floor at all this year. It's Florida State transfer Christian Nitu. Is somebody who we know Danny Sprinkle made that long trip to Tallahassee to watch him go through a workout. And it's something where he just kind of has that, that high-end skill set that you're looking for. And it's certainly not very developed at this point in time, which is okay for, an 18, 19-year-old who's still just like growing into his frame physically and certainly needs to put on some weight to hang with the physicality of, power conference basketball. But I look at a player like that and I feel like that's the other reason we wanted to just have this conversation, was because you can look at a player like that and there's been no news on him at this point in time from, just from our standpoint, at least. But I look at a player like that and I say, if you have that guy kind of sitting on the bench and, Jacob Ogdasevich is done after this season, Frank Kapdong is done after this year. all of a sudden you're just looking for that extra depth next year. And Matty Traore's got a couple of years of eligibility remaining. You can add those two guys together. Plus you've got Lathan Somerville, who's got 3 years of eligibility. You're still just looking pretty solid in the front court there. And then obviously, Hans Steinbach is a freshman coming in. So you hope you can keep him around for a couple of seasons. But all of a sudden that depth just is exactly where it seems like Danny wants it to be.
And it's built to be a Big Ten roster, kind of like what we talk about with football, where you have both the depth and the bodies at the starting positions and the bodies that can handle the physicality. You have enough pieces where you're not pigeonholed if you lose one or two guys. Where if Frank goes down again this year, I think you and I are much more confident in the reserves that are going to be filling his spot. And let's say Zoom, has some missing ends where you got guards there. And you don't root for injury, but the point is Danny has set this roster up to where no matter what happens, whether you lose 1, 2, 3 guys, you still have the pieces in rotation behind them to where that fall off, it exists, but it's nowhere near what it was last season, which was basically like, hey, if Great gets double teamed, we're kind of SOL here.
And that was the whole thing when Frank went down was, that's when the lack of depth really started the show, and why it was so nice and just refreshing really to go out and see the way that this coaching staff attacked the transfer portal this time around. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank the live videos tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout the offseason. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday.